Good morning. I'm pleased to welcome nearly 500 members of the Metro family that have signed up for this webinar today. In the next 2 hours, we are going to go over the new regulations that came from the federal government as it relates to supporting our workforce in during the COVID-19 pandemic. The knowledge comes from my team, Lindsay Mason, Nick Arevalo Parrish, and Sandy Franco have done a great job putting this together. But our partners in Jesse Soto and Juan Cordero are essential to.
Are you there?
Oops,
Are you there?
We're going to get rid of the phone here for a minute. Okay, there we go. We're really essential, and you'll be hearing from them today as well. We also reached out to our partners in operations. Nancy and Diane represented operations really well to put this program together in a way that's going to be easy, the easiest possible way to enact federal regulations. Before I turn this over, I think there's only really one goal that I have today, and I'm calling it the 4 C's. At the end of this session, if you guys, I hope that you know how to correctly administer these guidelines. So it's about being correct. It's also about being consistent. I think there's nothing more important about how people feel about fairness and equity than consistency. And hopefully what we learned today will allow us all to be consistent. The 3rd C is confidentiality. This is still, whether someone contracts the virus or is at risk of contracting it, it is their personal health care. It is protected by HIPAA, but it's also a matter of just respect and dignity for each other. So we need to really hold privileged information very close to the vest and make sure we secure that. And the last C is compassionate. And we can give you a lot of rules here today and move through this, but there's nothing that's going to make it more successful for you as a manager than listening to your people, understanding how stressful this is for all of us, and being compassionate as we move forward to implement this. That's my guidance for you. I'm going to turn this over to Lindsay. And Lindsay, thank you so much.
Thanks, Joanne. So as we get started today, I wanted to kind of go over a few housekeeping items. Today's session is being recorded. So if you guys need to rewatch this, I know that we're going to go through some things that are a little confusing when you first hear it or maybe seem a bit complicated. So the recording will give you an opportunity to kind of review that information as you need to. And it's also available for anybody in the agency who wants to watch. After the webinar today, a copy of the presentation, the video recording, our new FAQs, and all the new updated forms are going to be available on our SharePoint by the end of the business day today. We'll also make sure that more information will be distributed via email and posted on our intranet site in the next coming days. If you have any questions today, as we're going through the webinar, we are live. So if you have questions, you can submit them in the chat, or you can send an email to covidleave@metro.net. We're going to reserve all the questions for the end of the presentation. So I'll get through all the material, and then we'll take questions in the order that they're received. So kicking it off.
Hi, Lindsay.
Yeah.
Hi, Lindsay. I want to interject. I'm getting several people in the chat saying that they cannot view the video. And so I'm wondering if, Nick, if you can maybe email out everyone the link. I know sometimes the link in the calendar notice is a little finicky. So maybe if you email it out, and then if everyone who's having difficulties will click on the link that's emailed, I think that it might be a little bit better. But they are able to hear it. At least that's what I'm seeing. That few people can hear it but can't see it.
Yes,
but again, as you mentioned, that this is being recorded and they will be able to review it after.
Yes, absolutely.
And a few people are saying use Chrome. So maybe that might be helpful.
I'm sorry, what was that last thing you said?
There's a few comments saying to use Chrome.
Oh, to use Chrome. Yeah, the Chrome browser.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll go ahead and jump into the material. And as Sandy mentioned, for those who need to catch up, they can rewatch this once the recorded video is posted.
Okay. All right.
So we're meeting today to talk about the Families First Coronavirus Relief Act, the FFCRA. The FFCRA has two different components to it. One is an emergency paid sick leave component, and the other is an emergency expanded FML leave component. The law is actually effective today and through the end of the year. It applies to all government agencies and to certain private sector employers. The law itself is not retroactive. So as you're all aware, we're currently under our own Metro designed paid leave scheme for COVID related leaves. But the FFCRA says you don't get any quote unquote credit for that leave. So in other words, as soon as Metro enacts this new process, everybody's going to kind of start fresh with their paid leave entitlements under this new leave process. So, our current leave process, we've got forms 1, 2, and 3 using codes SAH and COV, and they cover various circumstances. This current process we have in place doesn't align with the requirements of the FFCRA. So what we're going to be covering today is going to replace the current process. What that means for us is that we're not going to have the COV and SAH pay codes available as of April 5th, which is the start of the next pay period. So do not extend any of the current agreements past that date, because starting then we will have to be operating under the new leave process. I know this might be confusing for some employees. They might ask you, well, I'm already under an agreement and you told me I had leave through April 10th, so what do I do? They just need to fill out a new request form, and as long as they still have a qualifying reason for paid leave under this new process, then you can approve their leave. So again, kind of an overview of the FFCRA and those two components. We're going to refer to that paid sick leave component as EPSL and the FML component as EFML. So we're going to use those acronyms today. So looking at EPSL, generally employees are going to get up to 80 hours of paid leave for multiple qualifying reasons. There's all different kinds of reasons why you might qualify. And depending on what reason you qualify, you will receive full pay or 2/3 of your pay, and that both of those pays are subject to different caps that I'll go in more detail about. On the EFML side, this is a 12-week leave entitlement that runs against your regular FML balance, so it's not a separate leave entitlement, and it's specifically for childcare purposes. So portions of this leave are actually paid. Weeks 1 and 2 are unpaid, and then subsequent weeks are paid at a 2/3 rate, again, subject to various limits that I'll go in more detail about. So let's first start with emergency paid sick leave, or EPSL. As I mentioned, it's generally going to provide employees with up to 80 hours of paid leave, which is paid by Metro for various reasons. And depending on the reason, you're either going to get 100% or 2/3 of your pay, subject to various caps. All employees are eligible on day 1 of employment. So that means that your temps, your intermittent employees, your transportation associates, your ELTs, your administrative interns, they're all eligible. Another kind of threshold requirement for eligibility here is that the employee must be unable to work or telework because of one of the qualifying reasons, which we'll get into more detail about. So in other words, one of the qualifying reasons is what's preventing me from either reporting to work or being able to telework. And just as a reminder, whether an employee can telework or telecommute is really a management decision at management's discretion. So let's look at the qualifying reasons. We have the employee is unable to work or telework because they are subject to federal, state, or local quarantine or isolation order related to COVID-19. They've been advised by their healthcare provider to self-quarantine due to concerns related to COVID-19. They're experiencing symptoms of COVID-19 and seeking a medical diagnosis. The employee might be caring for an individual who is subject to a federal, state, or local quarantine or isolation order related to COVID-19. Employee could be caring for an individual who has been advised by a healthcare provider to self-quarantine due to concerns, or caring for their child because the school and or place of care of the child has been closed. The employee could be caring for their child because the child care provider is unavailable due to COVID-19 precautions. And finally, the employee could be experiencing any other substantially similar condition as specified by the Secretary of Health and Human Services in consultation with Treasury and Labor Departments. So we're going to do a deep dive into each of these reasons. So starting with reason number 1, employee is unable to work or telework because they are subject to a federal, state, or local quarantine or isolation order related to COVID-19. So this does apply to stay-at-home orders and ordered business closures, but keeping in mind that Metro is exempt from the California and the LA County stay-at-home orders by virtue of the type of work we do. You know, we're providing essential services to the public. So our operations don't fall under this law. So, you know, if an employee says, well, LA County is under stay-at-home order, so I can't come to work, that's not going to be a qualifying reason here because, again, as essential workers, we may have to report to work. This reason, if someone did qualify, would pay the employee at their regular rate of pay up to $511 per day and $5,110 in total. So over that 80-hour period, the employee can be paid up to those amounts per day and then in the aggregate. Moving to qualifying reason number 2. This will probably be a very common one that you encounter. The employee is unable to work or telework because they have been advised by their healthcare provider to self-quarantine due to concerns related to COVID-19. This is where you'll get employees saying, you know, my healthcare provider said I have an underlying medical condition that makes me more susceptible to coronavirus. So they're advising me to self-quarantine for 14 days. Those kind of cases would fall under this qualifying reason. This type of leave could run concurrent with regular FML, depending on the reason for the person being off. If they're just precautionary quarantine, then I don't think that would be something to run against FML. But if they actually have, you know, some sort of symptoms, you know, or if they themselves are actually experiencing a medical condition, then obviously that would run concurrent with their regular FML. You can request medical documentation to support this leave, and you should. And similar to reason number 1, this qualifying reason also pays the employee at their regular rate of pay up to $511 per day and $5,110 in total. Qualifying reason number 3, employee is unable to work or telework because they're experiencing symptoms of COVID-19 and are seeking a medical diagnosis. So that second part is important because we do have some employees who might be coming to work exhibiting flu-like symptoms and are being sent home. So those folks may fall under here, assuming that they go to seek treatment. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to have a confirmed case of COVID, but you have to be seeking a diagnosis. So it's really going to depend on what kind of medical documentation the employee provides that to substantiate, you know, the need for this qualifying reason. And I will say the law is not very clear about what the documentation should look like or what exactly we can request, but we don't want to request any information about what the underlying diagnosis is. If an employee does test positive for COVID-19, or we suspect an employee might test positive due to exposure, there is a process to handle that. And so that might be disclosed, but we still need to keep in mind that that information should only be disclosed on a need-to-know basis, and corporate safety has outlined a process for that. If we're talking about any other medical condition, like I hear asthma, diabetes, hypertension, you know, all of those conditions might make a person more susceptible to the disease. We don't ask about those. We don't ask the employee what the underlying condition is. So again, make sure that when the employee makes this request, they've provided appropriate medical documentation to support this leave. And once again, this leave pays at the regular rate of pay up to those dollar amounts. So the theme with these 3 reasons is that the employee is taking leave for themselves, and that's entitling them to full pay subject to those caps. Looking at qualifying reasons 4 and 5, the employee is unable to work or telework because they're caring for an individual who is subject to a federal, state, or local quarantine or isolation order, or the employee is unable to work or telework because they're caring for an individual who has been advised by a healthcare provider to self-quarantine due to concerns related to COVID-19. So you see that these two reasons kind of mirror reasons 1 and 2, except in these cases, the employee isn't caring for themselves, they're caring for an individual. So note that language individual is very intentional when this law was created. It doesn't say family member. So you don't want to tell an employee, oh, you're caring for, your neighbor, and that's not a family member, it's not going to qualify. The law doesn't require that it's a family relationship. However, you could, I think at most to substantiate this, you could request some sort of medical documentation, such as like an FML certificate, if it is a family member. But otherwise, it might just be the employee's own statement, that this is the person they're caring for. Leave for these reasons entitles an employee to receive pay at a 2/3 rate, up to $200 per day and $2,000 in total. Qualifying reasons 6 and 7 relate to childcare, where an employee is unable to work or telework because they're caring for their child because the school or place of care of the child has been closed, or the employee is unable to work or telework because they're caring for their child because the child care provider is unavailable due to COVID-19 precautions. So in other words, maybe the school or daycare is closed, or I have a nanny who is over 65 and she's self-quarantining, therefore she's not available, so I don't have childcare. That could be a qualifying reason here. Something to point out, in our current leave scheme, we've been looking at children under the age of 14, so 13 and younger. Here, we've aligned the definition of a child to meet that under the FMLA. So a child is a son or daughter under the age of 18 or over the age of 18 who has a medical disability, mental or physical, that prevents them from caring for themselves, and the employee provides care for that for that child. So again, an adult disabled child who is unable to care for themselves. So this could also be a stepchild, it could be a foster child, or it could be someone to whom you stand in loco parentis to. What that means is maybe, again, I don't have a kind of family relationship there, or even necessarily a foster relationship, but it's a child that I basically I care for them 100% of the time, even though they're not biologically my child. You may qualify under in loco parentis there. We can request documentation from the employee to support the school closure. I know right now all schools are closed, so it's not really something that you need to belabor with employees, because we know LAUSD is closed and most, if not all, other school districts are closed. But I think it does become important as hopefully sooner rather than later we start to lift these stay-at-home and closure orders. So it is important to get the documentation because we don't know when schools might reopen. So we just want to have that information. We also want to know, what are the ages of the children? Where do they go to school? Just real basic information. This leave may run concurrent with emergency family medical leave, which I will get into in part 2 of this presentation. So we'll talk about that more later. And leave here also entitles an employee to pay at a 2/3 rate up to those $200 day limit and the $2,000 total limit. So finally, qualifying reason number 8. Employee is unable to work or telework because they are experiencing any other substantially similar condition as specified by the Secretary of Health and Human Services in consultation with Treasury and Labor Departments. What does that mean? It's a lot of kind of legal jargon thrown in there and agency names. It's very unclear. We kind of see this as a catch-all provision, but the law is really unclear what this means. And there really, at this point, we haven't identified any reason that would actually fall under this qualifying reason. So it's really unlikely that this should be utilized at this point, at least until we get further guidance from the Department of Labor about what this actually means. But right now we're not aware of, any other substantially similar conditions that have been identified by Secretary of Health and Human Services. So when that information comes available, obviously we'll put that out there. But if employees ask about this, what does it mean? I would say the laws are very unclear at this point, but we have not yet identified a qualifying reason or a reason that would qualify under this particular provision. So I kind of touched on documentation throughout that. As I mentioned, we can request reasonable documentation to support medical related absences, whether it's an absence for yourself or to care for someone else. Similar to, like I said, the type of information that we may request when an employee submits an FML certification. We can also request reasonable documentation to support school closures. And to some extent, managers, you need to use your discretion. Like I said, if LAUSD is closed, don't make it more difficult for the employee and require them to submit that documentation. But as we move through this pandemic crisis, it may be important to attach that documentation because we don't know when schools are going to reopen. We also don't know what's going to happen over the summer when schools do close, and then there's daycare facilities that I'm sure employees use, like the YMCA and things like that, that are likely going to be closed if we're still under the same kind of an order. So just think about those things, think practically when you're dealing with this documentation. As I touched on, if any of these leaves run concurrent with an employee's FML, then obviously they're going to need to provide documentation that would be required under the FML, or at least enough documentation for us to be able to designate their leave as FML. And any questions about that, you can always submit to that COVID leave email address that we touched on later. And by the end of the presentation, you'll have all the information of who you need to contact with questions. So the duration for paid sick leave, as I've stated, it's up to 80 hours. So what this means is for full-time employees, we're talking 80 hours. You're generally working 40 hours a week. But part-time employees or employees who have varied schedules, some weeks I work 30 hours, some weeks I work 50 hours, there's a different calculation that we look at for those employees. And you look at the number of hours that the employee works on average over a 2-week period. So you're looking at basically average hours worked over 2 weeks. And you can look back from the date of the request. The leave can be used for partial day absences, so it doesn't have to be used in full day increments. It can be used intermittently, although if you're taking leave for yourself because you have COVID, I would say that's unlikely to be used intermittently. But if you're taking childcare leave, for example, that may be intermittent. Maybe you're, telecommuting part-time and then you're caring for your child part-time. So it's just going to depend on the case, if it makes sense. Also, the leave can be used for multiple qualifying reasons. So, for example, if I need to take 40 hours for childcare and then I need to take 40 hours because I've been ordered to self-quarantine, I can do that. But I can only combine the leave into a maximum of 80 hours total. So I can't exceed that 80 hours no matter how many qualifying reasons I might have. So overtime, where does overtime play into this? Overtime is a factor when you're looking at the hours worked. But again, we're still operating under that 80-hour cap. Oh, it's over a 2-week period, right? 80 hours, 40 hours a week. So the example that's been provided is we have an employee, Jane, who's been scheduled to work 50 hours a week. That's her normal schedule. And so what she can do is take 50 hours of paid sick leave in the first week and then take 30 hours of paid sick leave in the second week. So she's getting her full hours for the first week and then partial for the second week. Either way, she's capped at that 80 hours. And I also just want to say this, I don't think anyone would actually do it, but it's possible. You can substitute your own paid leave for this too. You don't have to take paid sick leave, and I'll get into that a little bit more, but here we are with pay. So when we're talking about full pay, obviously those employees are getting 100% of their pay, but only up to those caps, that $511 and $5,110 in total caps. Those employees can't integrate, but they can use their own accrued paid leave, so their TOWP, their sick, their vacation, instead of taking EPSL. That's something the employee can elect to do. And employees receiving 2/3 pay can actually elect to do that as well. But like I said, I don't know why you would want to when you can integrate your paid leaves with your paid sick leave payments. So in other words, you can decide, I'm just going to take the 2/3 payment from Metro and that's it. I'm going to take the 2/3 payment from Metro and then I'm going to supplement that with my own paid leave, similar to what we do with those who take STI or paid family leave benefits. Or I don't want to take any of those. I only want to take my own TOWP. You're able to do that. And as I said, for those on full pay, you only have the two options. Take the EPSL or use your own accrued paid leaves. No integration there. So what does the leave request and approval process look like? As I mentioned earlier, the forms are going to be posted by close of business today. I think they're very clear. They're Form A, B, and C. So we moved away from the old 1, 2, and 3. We're now under A, B, and C. Employees are going to complete Form A. They have to submit that to their direct supervisor, who will then evaluate the request and either approve or deny. We're recommending that at this time you just maintain those forms in the employee's departmental file. It may be later down the road that we're going to centralize those in the employee's central personnel file, but for now, just make sure you maintain those records. And again, a point on confidentiality. Obviously, you want to maintain the confidentiality of those records to the extent that you can. You know, there's obviously staff that's going to be involved in monitoring the leaves, processing the leaves, kind of just overseeing that whole process. Or management might need to know, HR folks are going to know, but this isn't something that should be shared globally with the department. We need to be discreet and really respect people's confidentiality, whether the request is medical or not, honestly. And very importantly, and I mentioned this before, we do not request information about underlying medical conditions. So if an employee is telling you, I have to be out because my doctor says my underlying medical condition makes me more susceptible to COVID, you can't then ask, well, what's your underlying condition? Because I want to see if it matches what the CDC says. That's not our job. We are not doctors. We need to listen to employees' doctors and take their opinions and not draw our own. And it's illegal for us to request that information from employees. So avoid that. I'm going to turn it over to Juan to talk about timekeeping and what this will look like when you go to enter your employee's time. So Juan?
Okay, so to record the emergency paid sick leave, we've created 2 new codes. The first code is EPQ, and that code is used for qualifying reasons 1, 2, and 3. And as Lindsay mentioned, that will pay at regular rate up to $511 per day and $5,110 in total. To enter this, you would enter 8 hours, for example, using EPQ. The second code that was created is EPC, and EPC is for qualifying reasons 4 through 8, which pay at 2/3 of regular rate, up to $200 per day and $2,000 in total. You can integrate those 2/3 with other personal time to get to 8 hours. So if that is being done, then you would enter EPC for 5.33 hours, and then other integrations such as TOB, sick time, etc., for the 2.67 hours. So that would get you back to your 8. So again, EPQ is for the regular rate up to $511 per day, and EPC is for where it pays 2/3 of regular rate for reasons 4 through 8. If you are going to use this EPSL to integrate with your ESML, which Lindsay referred to earlier, you can do that. And if you are going to do that, then you will record it as follows. So EPC would be the 5.33, and the integrated leave would be 2.67. That's basically the same as above, right? But if you are integrating with FML, you have to add 2 more codes so that the FML portion is properly tracked. So we created a code FMU. FMU is only to be used during the first 2 weeks that are unpaid. The reason we have the code is because we want to make sure that we track those first 2 weeks. And then you use FML as you normally would. For recording any of these new codes, we need to make sure that we use the new project and tasks that were created for COVID-related expenses and hours. So we've got bus operations, rail, and admin. They all start with 1019, 01, and then 0.01, 0.02, and 0.03.
Great. Thank you, Juan.
You're welcome.
So with EPSL, what happens after those 80 hours? You're going to get employees who come to you and say, okay, my 80 hours are up. Now what are you going to give me? So the answer is you're going to follow regular leave of absence procedures at that point. So it's really going to depend on why the employee is seeking leave. But ultimately, leave is going to be paid through the employee's own accrued paid leave. So TWP, vacation, sick, whatever. And again, depending on the reason for leave, they could be eligible for SDI or PFL benefits. SDI is for those who are off for their own disability. PFL is there for when you're off to care for a family member. Those benefits are not administered by Metro. They're administered by the California Employment Development Department, the EDD. So employees will need to contact EDD if they're interested in integrating those benefits with their own paid leave if they're eligible. If your employee has no accrued leave, what are they going to do? Well, if they qualify for SDI or PFL, then that's what they're going to receive, or they will have to go unpaid. And this is all assuming that you approve the leave of absence in the first place. You don't necessarily have to approve it. It will depend on what the reason is that the employee is requesting leave. But this is really a management decision at that point, once those 80 hours are up. So if you do approve the leave, then that instance of absence will not be chargeable. Also, just as a reminder, remember to run any subsequent leave against FML if they're taking leave for childcare. That will be a EFML reason. So you can use FML there, or if they're caring for themselves or a family member with a medical condition, that could also be an FML situation. So just remember that leave might need to run concurrent with this. So when the employee hits 30 days off, what happens? You know that 30-day mark is generally a trigger for employment status to change. It can be. It's not necessarily in all cases here. It'll depend on what the reason is the person is off. So, for example, if your employee exhausts the 80 hours of paid leave because they're off for themselves, and then they tell you, well, I still have my personal condition. I need to be off longer. Great. You approve additional leave for them, but that leave exceeds, now you're going, above 30 days total leave. What do? If they're off for themselves, you need to pass them to DI. And most of you, all of you should be familiar with that process. You pass them to P status, leave reason is DI. Attach the completed Form A, their healthcare provider's note, and submit it to covidleave@metro.net. Short-term disability compliance, who is within my team, will be managing that leave. They're the folks who manage all of your day-to-day short-term leave issues. So you have different reps, Rosalind, Jenny, and Liz, who are assigned to various cost centers. You should all know them. They are going to be very well versed in this process and will be able to help guide you through. If you have an employee who is on leave to care for someone else, you're going to submit the path to FL. So again, same kind of situation when you're dealing with an employee who takes FML to care for a family member and they're off for more than 30 days. It's the same general process. You're going to, again, include a completed Form A and any supporting documentation and email that to covidleave@metro.net. And again, short-term disability compliance will be managing that leave from then on. That means they're going to monitor the employee's leave, and then help coordinate return to work once that happens. What about if the employee ends up taking a full 12 weeks of FML to go off for childcare purposes? This leave is going to be managed by the department. Departments currently manage an employee's FML, and so nothing here really changes. There's no PAF required. It's going to be management's responsibility to monitor those agreements and monitor the leave. The end date will be indicated on the form, so departments will just need to track that and ensure that employees are compliant with their agreements. They're on leave for any other reason. Just on a case-by-case basis, we'll take those. If you have a one-off that you don't know where it fits in the scheme, email us and we can help you. It could be a PAF to DI or FL, or maybe no PAF required at all. So just keep in mind, if there is anything that doesn't fit into one of these three buckets, we'll deal with that on a case-by-case basis. So what does the return to work process look like for folks who've been out? If they've been out on disability or family leave status, you can continue with the standard practice. Again, the leave's going to be managed by my team in Wellbeing Services, and we'll coordinate the return to work physical and handle the clearance process and all that. For childcare and school closures, if the employee's been off for more than 30 days, there is no physical required prior to their return to work. The forms B and C will indicate what their return to work date is. And you as the department are going to be monitoring that leave and return to work process. If the employee was off for less than 30 days, then you can just follow the regular CBA guidelines as to what's required. Doctor's notes might be required for certain absences of certain durations. And certainly if someone has been off due to an ordered self-quarantine, we want to have a doctor's release prior to the employee's return to work. Because if the employee is saying, yeah, I've been quarantined because I may have been exposed. For example, there might be an employee who comes to you and says, I was just traveling and I was at a conference and they just told me that I might have been exposed. And so they ordered me to self-quarantine. That employee will need a note, a clearance note from his or her personal doctor clearing them to return to work, or at least indicating that they are asymptomatic, after the end of the 14-day period. I know doctors are real hesitant these days to say, no, they don't have COVID, not a confirmed case. They're most likely not going to say that unless the employee has actually been tested. So we can take simply a certification that the employee is not showing signs and symptoms of the virus, and that would be sufficient. So that wraps up the emergency paid sick leave portion. So now we're going to move into emergency family medical leave, or EFML. So what this means is it's really an expansion to our current FMLA, the Family Medical Leave Act, which I think all of you are familiar with. And what the FMLA does is provides job protected leave for various purposes, generally to care for yourself due to a medical condition or to care for a family member. This expansion now adds childcare as a qualifying reason under the FMLA. As discussed, you know that there's EPSL payments that are available for childcare purposes. So this leave can run concurrent and will run concurrent if an employee is eligible for FML. What do you need to be eligible? The eligibility requirements are different from the other reasons under FMLA. So this is an important distinction. Under the normal FMLA, in order to qualify for leave, you need to have worked 1,250 hours and been employed for 1 year with the employer in order to qualify. Here, those requirements do not apply. The only eligibility requirement is that you have to have been employed at Metro for 30 calendar days. So what this means is you might have an employee who's on day 15 of employment who requests this. They're going to be denied, but they're going to become eligible on day 31. So the qualifying reasons here, again, are only limited to childcare. So we want to think of this lens. We're only talking about childcare when we're talking about this expansion. And remember that this is a temporary expansion. It's only good through the end of the calendar year at this point. The law could obviously, decide to expand. Government could decide to expand that into the next calendar year, but we're not there yet. So what are the reasons? Employee is unable to work or telework because they need to care for their child because the child's school or place of care has been closed, or because their child's child care provider is unavailable due to a public health emergency related to COVID-19, as declared by a federal, state, or local authority. So you see how that mirrors the child care qualifying reasons in EPSL. Again, the definition of a child care is exactly that of under the FMLA, what I explained before. It's a son or daughter under the age of 18 or over the age of 18 if they suffer from a medical condition or disability that requires the employee to care for them. It could be a stepchild, a foster child, or someone for whom the employee is sitting in loco parentis. So kind of refer to your FMLA knowledge there when determining if a child qualifies under this. The leave duration is up to 12 weeks at 480 hours that we're well aware of under FML. But remember, this is not a separate leave entitlement. It's not an additional 12 weeks. This runs against an employee's FML balance. So in addition to that eligibility requirement of 30 days, your eligibility here really does depend on how much FML you've used within the 12-month period prior to the date of your request. So if you've exhausted your FML in the last year, because maybe you were off for pregnancy, maybe you were off for caring for a family member, whatever it was, if you've exhausted your FML, then you wouldn't be entitled to anything additional until you become eligible. You know, we operate on a rolling 12-month basis, so just keep that in mind. This leave, just like with regular FML, can be taken intermittently or on a part-time or reduced schedule basis. One question that I know will come up that we don't have a ton of clarity on at this point is, what if both of the spouses work at Metro? Can they both receive the same amount of time, 12 weeks respectively, so 24 weeks total, to be off to care for their child? And at this point, it's really unclear. The FMLA is not consistent in their opinion. Certain reasons for taking FMLA require the spouses to split the leave. Others don't. Baby bonding is one of the reasons that an employee or two spouses have to split those 12 weeks. And if we want to analogize the current situation, childcare is kind of similar to bonding. So if we're using that rationale, then our guidance right now is that spouses should most likely split those 12 weeks if they're off for childcare. But that is unclear, and if we get further guidance on that point, we'll obviously update as needed. But for now, we'll go with the recommendation that if I have a husband and a wife who are both working at Metro and need to take childcare, they're going to have to share that 12-week period. Now, note that says spouses. It doesn't say, boyfriend, girlfriend, fiancés, whatever. So those folks might actually get two separate entitlements, and they're not spouses. Looking at the paid leave component of this is very different from traditional FMLA. The first 80 hours or 2 weeks are unpaid under EFML, but you substitute EPSL during that time or your accrued paid leaves. So I can say, well, I'm just going to use all my TOWP for the first 2 weeks. Or you can say, no, I'll use the EPSL during those first 2 weeks and I'll integrate with my own paid leaves so I'll be made whole. You're absolutely able to do that. But just keep in mind, those first 2 weeks still are designated as FML, so they will count against your FMLA entitlement. Subsequent weeks, so after week 2, payment by Metro kicks in. Once again, it's at that 2/3 rate, the employee's regular rate of pay, and we look at the number of hours the employee would otherwise be scheduled to work. It's the same calculation as for EPSL. Here, there are also caps. The cap is a maximum daily payment of $200 per day and $10,000 in total. So when you're looking at the aggregate 12 weeks, you're looking at actually $12,000. $2,000 of EPSL payments and then $10,000 of EFML payments. As I mentioned, you can absolutely elect to integrate your paid leaves with this 2/3 payment in order to make you whole. What does the leave request and approval process look like? Here, the employee is going to complete Form B, And the direct supervisor is going to complete Form C, kind of similar to how our normal FML process works, where the employee makes a request and the supervisor submits an approval. That approval basically serves as a notice of designation for FMLA. So what the supervisor responsibility is upon receiving that form is you've got to determine if the person is eligible. First, have they been employed for 30 calendar days? And do they have FML hours available? And on the form, you're going to have to note, if they don't, how many do they have? We want to be clear on if you don't qualify, here's why. And the form spells that out very clearly. So you either approve or deny the request based on the eligibility, and then you provide a copy to the employee. That's very important. Employee needs to get a copy of that approval. And if they are approved, we want to put on there, here's how many hours you're approved for. And again, just as with the EPSL documents for now, just maintain those in the department file. Again, being mindful of confidentiality. It's not as important here because we're not dealing with medical conditions in this piece of FML, but it's still a good practice. We don't need to be sharing people's personal circumstances beyond those who need to know for administrative purposes. So I'm going to have Juan jump in again to talk about the timekeeping aspect of EFML.
Okay, very good. With EFML, we've also created 2 new codes. FMU, as we talked about briefly earlier, is used to track the first 2 weeks of unpaid EFML. Even though it's unpaid, we have to track it towards that eligibility, the first 2 weeks being unpaid. So what you would enter for that is you would enter 8 hours of FMU and 8 hours of FML, because as Lindsay said, it counts against your FML balance. If you are going to use the paid sick leave with your FML, then you would code it the way we have it listed on page 26. So you would have EPC for 5.33, other integration for 2.67, and then again, FMU and FML, so that we can track that correctly. So FMU is for the unpaid portion. FME is for weeks 3 through 12, which pay at the 2/3 of regular rate, $200 per day with a $2,000 maximum. To record this on a daily basis, you would enter FME because it's paid at 5.33, then enter an FML integration code like FMV or FMT for the 2.67 hours, and you would still need to enter FML so that those hours, those total hours, go against the FML bank. Now, I want to make one quick correction about the project and tasks down below. The project and tasks that I listed, I put the task backwards. So it's 1019-0101, 1019-0201, and 1019-0301. We'll get that corrected in the slides before anything gets distributed, and also in any payroll FAQ that we put together.
Great. Thanks, Juan.
You're welcome.
Okay, so what happens if an employee has no FML available or they exhaust their FML after starting on this leave, and then they still have a need for childcare? Again, refer to your regular leave of absence procedures. It's up to management to approve or deny these requests for additional leave. If an employee does decide to take additional leave but doesn't have any FML available, we won't charge it as an instance of absence. But the employee would have to be paid through their own accrued leave banks. And if they don't have any available, then they're going to have to go unpaid. So it almost looks like a personal leave at that point. And again, it's up to management to determine if you want to approve that kind of leave. The return to work process is very straightforward, and I kind of covered this already, but if you've got an employee who's out for less than 30 days, then obviously no return to work physical is needed. If the employee goes out for more than 30 days on this type of FML, you're not having to pass them. They don't need a return to work physical. You got forms B and C that say what the duration of the leave is, so you're just going to monitor that as a department. So that wraps up the meat of the presentation. As I said, you can absolutely refer back to this webinar as a tool. This is going to be posted after today. I also wanted to note that we are developing an e-learning that is designed specifically for employees. So they'll be able to take that course and learn about these leaves from an employee perspective. I think we're also already discussing doing another one of these live webinars sometime next week. I think that would be valuable since we'll be in the new pay period at that time. So if you have questions, you know, that'll be a good resource for you. But even after today, if you don't get your questions answered, you've got resources. We're going to have a very comprehensive FAQ posted on our intranet. You know, we already have one and it's basically been overhauled due to this new process. So we've got tons of information in there, very detailed in the weeds kind of questions that might help with some of your real kind of one-off or unique situations, because I know there are a lot of those. There's a lot of gray area in this stuff. And if you do have specific questions about the paid sick leave, FML, timekeeping, or just general COVID leave of absence questions, you can email that COVID leave at metro.net central mailbox, or the phone number that we've created specifically for this, which is at extension 24840. Both of these kind of inboxes are being monitored by my staff. And so just keep in mind, you know, we're operating on business hours here. So after hours questions, or, you know, questions that might come on the weekend, there might be some delay in response there. Just keep that in mind. But we're going to be monitoring the entire workday. So we will try our best to get back to you within, you know, 24 hours of your question.